Welcome to Carrickfergus Vineyard, a place of hope where lives are changing. We're a church in the heart of Carrickfergus, passionate about seeing people's lives changed by the love of Jesus. The following message was given at one of our Sunday services.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ellie. If I have not met you yet, it is lovely to see you. I'm very excited to be sharing with you guys this morning. I'm also a little bit hyper because I just found out about Owen getting the job and I'm really excited. So yeah, that's just such good news. But if you guys haven't been here, I actually haven't been here the last couple of weeks, I've been away, but we are doing a series called Heroes of the Faith based on Hebrews 11. And so today we're going to be talking about Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, someone who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So to start off, what do we know about Peter? Just some basic facts. So Peter was a Galilean fisherman before he met Jesus from a city called Bethsaida. He had a brother called Andrew, who's also a fisherman. Peter's original name is Simon, but he is known as Peter the Apostle, Simon Peter, or Cephas, because Jesus named him Cephas when he first met him, which is Aramaic for rock, and which translates to Peter in English. And so we're first introduced to Peter in Luke chapter 5, where we read that Jesus gets into Peter and Andrew's boat and tells him to go out a little bit from the shore, where Jesus then teaches from their boat. And then Jesus tells Peter to let down the nets into the sea, to which Simon responds, or Simon at this point, because he's just met him, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." And then the nets go down, and there's such a miraculously huge catch of fish that the nets actually begin to break, and the boat begins to be weighed down by all the fish that have been caught in the nets. And so even from our very first interaction with Peter, we can learn something. Peter and his brother Andrew knew what they were doing when it came to fishing. This is what they spent their entire days doing. They've been out all night and it has been proven that there are no fish to be caught where they are. And yet Peter obeys Jesus, even when it doesn't make sense to him. And I think today we can sometimes fall into the habit of thinking that we know best, of being very logical and realistic and rational, almost to a fault. But actually, when we look at the stories of the heroes of the faith, God often asks people to do things that aren't exactly logical or rational, like Noah building a boat before there's any sign of rain, or marching around the walls of Jericho to make them fall down, or here putting the nets back down to catch fish that don't seem to be there. Are we willing to obey God even when it doesn't make sense to us and maybe even cost us our pride a bit? Because you say so, I will. A sentence that I definitely want to practice more often. And so in this story, Jesus tells Peter and his brother Andrew to come with him and that they're going to be fishing for people now. And so they leave all that they have and they immediately follow Jesus as his disciples. And then as we move through the Gospels and follow the story of Peter, he becomes one of the closest disciples to Jesus, along with James and John, and one of the disciples that we often read about in some of the stories. And in Matthew 14, we read the famous story of Jesus walking on water. And when Jesus tells the disciples not to be afraid because it's him who has walked out to their boat, we read in verse 28, "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, beginning to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" This is one of the many moments where we see how undeniably human in nature Peter is, with a burst of fear and doubt, even with Jesus standing right in front of him. Where Peter has stepped out of the boat and had incredible faith and then lost some of that very faith in mere seconds when he sees the reality of the situation his boldness has actually landed him in. He's extremely relatable, isn't he? It reminds me of when we went to Lake Kilray with the youth a number of weeks ago, and we went up to one of the tallest inflatables where there's slides and then there's this jump, and I did have to seriously psych myself up to do it, and I was like, "You can do it, just jump, be brave, you're a youth leader, like, come on, it's easy." And then, because when you just look and you just jump, you don't actually look over the edge. It actually is easier to do. And then when you're in midair and you look down and realize the terrible mistake that you've made and your legs start going and you scream and you brace yourself to hit the water, the reality of that leap of faith is often very stark and very scary, actually. And Peter was victim to that as often as we can be. And Jesus grabs him by the hand just as he does us as well. Jesus doesn't leave in the moments of fear when we forget how to trust. He's actually right beside us. And actually, no matter how scared we are in those moments where we've stepped out of our comfort zone, living in full reliance on Jesus and him grabbing our hand allows us to reach a level of intimacy with him that we may not have reached if we had stayed in the boat. Where we live as God intended when he made us, fully trusting and surrendered to him. Is there somewhere in your life that God is asking for a step of faith? You have little faith, Jesus says. Why did you doubt? This is the same Peter who Jesus named, like Peter, Cephas, the rock, who he is now saying has little faith, which I think is really interesting, and I'm going to come back to this later. But around the same time as this story of Jesus and Peter walking on water, we read in Matthew 16 about when Jesus asks his disciples, who do the people say the Son of Man is? Or who do the crowd say I am? In another account, they replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you, he asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And so this moment is quite significant, where the disciples are publicly affirming Jesus' identity as the Messiah. And it's Peter who does this, who so boldly proclaims who Jesus is without hesitation. That sounds like more like Peter the rock, and Jesus reinforces the name that he has given him in that moment. Peter's getting it, he's on the right path, but it doesn't last very long. Only a handful of verses later, when Jesus is predicting his death and his resurrection to his disciples, we're actually told that Peter rebukes Jesus when he says this, to which Jesus responds, get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Yikes. We can see that Peter clearly has a deep love for Jesus, and knowing his power and his perfection is of course just so confused as to why this would need to happen. Not only to the Messiah, as we've just read, he's proclaimed, but also to one of his closest friends. I'm sure he was devastated. But even so, we see Peter fall short once again. And so Peter continues to walk with Jesus as it gets closer to his death. And we reach the Last Supper, where Jesus tells Peter that he will deny him. And even when Jesus directly confronts Peter about this, he remains confident in his loyalty, saying, even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. And even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. Peter can't imagine a reality where he lets down Jesus in such a way. Him, James and John are Jesus' very closest friends who have walked with him for about 3 years at this point, and were even there at the Transfiguration where they saw Jesus' glory in a way that is unfathomable. And yet we know how this part of the story goes. After Jesus is arrested and Peter follows a bit behind, he denies knowing Jesus when people recognize him, not once, but 3 times. A part of the story where we can think, why? Come on now, you're better than this, Peter. Can you not just do what you said you would do? And again, Peter relates to the human experience so well, how we can so fiercely love God and tell him how we're really going to go and talk about him and evangelize and live unapologetically as followers of Jesus. And then we get into conversations where it just seems easier not to talk about our faith or beliefs for the sake of not rocking the boat or not causing tension or out of fear of being asked questions we don't feel we have the answers to. We, like Peter, can have the best intentions And yet in a single moment, they go out the window, or I know for me, they can anyways. And we're left with the guilt of what we should have or what we could have said. Why wasn't I just bold? Why did I care so much about what they thought of me? And I'm sure Peter felt this too. I love the duality of Peter's character. A man who immediately leaves his life to follow Jesus, who boldly declares that he is the Messiah, and who steps out of the boat towards Jesus in faith. And yet he's also the man who begins to sink out of fear, who rebukes Jesus when he doesn't understand his plans, and who, even with the best intentions, denies Jesus when things get hard. Peter the Rock. It's interesting how Jesus chose him to name that instead of any of the other disciples. Jesus knew that Peter would fall short. He knew that he would deny him, and yet he still named him that when he first met him. And I think we focus on Peter denying Jesus because it's, of course, such a pivotal moment for him. He's really messed it up now. But we actually read in John chapter 21 this beautiful moment of redemption for Peter. Jesus asks him if he loves him 3 times, to which Peter responds, yes, of course. And Jesus responds to Peter each time by telling him to feed and to take care of his sheep. This parallel with Jesus asking him 3 times is not only Peter just simply being forgiven, but Jesus is then entrusting Peter with the job of being a shepherd to people, with leading them to Jesus. Jesus is asking Peter to establish his kingdom on earth, something that we then clearly see him doing throughout Acts, and as we read the guidance that he reads in the letters of 1st and 2nd Peter. Jesus saw something in Peter when he first met him. He intentionally named him. And the journey definitely wasn't linear, but Peter fulfilled his purpose as the rock. I'm sure he often didn't feel like the man for the job. Not the most consistent, for sure. And actually, in the first story in Luke chapter 5, where Jesus calls him to be a disciple and tells him to cast the nets down and they catch all the fish, Peter is so astonished by what Jesus has done and the miracle he's performed that he actually tells him to go away because Peter felt so unworthy of even being near Jesus. And Peter most likely felt that way multiple times when he messed up. And we can feel that way too. When we deny Jesus, when we lose faith and trust, when we are angry because we can't understand God's plan, we can take ourselves off and think, God, I'm just too unfaithful. I've messed up again. I'm just too far gone. How can you use me when I just keep letting you down? But something that we can learn from the story of Peter is that we will all fall short, even with the best intentions. We will have moments where we think we're starting to get it, and then we find ourselves struggling again. But Jesus has given us purpose and has called us by name. He has placed things in each of our hearts, and we all have a part to play in establishing his kingdom. And that isn't linear, and it's definitely not easy. But in John 21, when Jesus has risen from the dead and appears to his disciples at the Sea of Galilee, and when Peter hears that it is the Lord, he jumps out of the boat. We're actually told that the boat wasn't even that far from the shore, but he jumps out of the boat into the water to swim to Jesus as fast as he can. Bearing in mind, since the last time Peter saw Jesus, he has denied him and probably felt like he had let him down. And this parallel is something actually Charlotte Curran talked about in her seminar that some of us were at NUA, about how something Peter clearly learns and realizes makes him go from someone who, when he first meets Jesus, tries to create space between Jesus and himself because he feels so unworthy. And then he becomes someone who knows that he is messed up and is imperfect, but wants more than anything to get close to Jesus. Because Jesus is so good and so merciful, and being close to him is the greatest thing that we can ever do, especially when we have messed up. He has his arms open wide. His posture towards us never changes. Maybe you feel far from the Lord. Maybe you know that there is something that he has asked you to do or to step into, but you've tried to have faith and it hasn't worked out. You've been scared. Run to Jesus again, like Peter did. The name Jesus has given you hasn't changed because of your mistakes. He still has so much for you when you go to him. Step out of the boat again. He is with you. Each moment in Peter's journey brought him to become a pivotal leader in the early church. He was the rock because of each moment that shaped him and each moment that Jesus used to refine him. No part of the journey is without purpose. Wherever you're at, go to Jesus and ask him, who do you say I am? Remain in that truth and that purpose and nothing else.
Thanks for listening to the Carrickfergus Vineyard podcast. If you'd like to find out more about our church, please visit our website at carrickfergusvineyard.org.